All right. I think we're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. I want to welcome Walter Kirn and Liel Leibovitz here to join me for a conversation about the turn, political homelessness in this moment. Couple of housekeeping issues for tonight's Zoom, because we only have a brief time with Liel and Walter. What we want to do is keep the chat limited. So if you would like to ask us questions, put it in the Q&A. We are going to be dropping a bunch of things for you in the chat, but don't chat back at us, or you can't chat back at us. That said, if you want to email us either during the event or after the event, we're also going to be dropping into the chat an email address, newlifeworld@protonmail.com. You can send a question for anyone specifically or for all of us, and I promise we'll respond. We put together a little reading list for people of just a few articles that were useful to some people, some of us, and some people around us in the last few years, coming to terms with the topic that we're discussing tonight. Finally, and maybe most fun, tonight, if you sign up for either Tablet's newsletter or Walter's Substack, you will enter a raffle to win Russ and Daughter's gift package. So we're going to send you the best gift in the world, the gift of smoked fish from New York City. So sign up for both. Signups should be in the chat. So get ready for a gift. And without further ado—
hand smoked by Mayor de Blasio on a subway grate.
Okay, hang on. We're going to get into it. Hold on. All right. So we are here to talk about political homelessness, which seems to be, if I'm judging by the number of attendees here tonight, a topic of real interest. For some people who experience it, the dawning of the sense of homelessness comes in three different stages. There's a shock and denial stage. There's what we think of as the acceptance and the emotional reorientation stage. And then there's one where you start to ask yourself questions about how to move forward practically. So tonight you have two incredible people here to talk to us about both of those things. And we're going to sort of roughly have the conversation move through all of those. And I'm going to try to weave in your questions while we talk. In order to sort of set us up and get us started, what I wanted, Liel, you have about 300 people on this Zoom so far. Let's assume that all 300 of them feel what you feel. Can you describe for us, to start us off, what you think the problem is and how you think we got here?
So, first of all, what a terrifying vision. 300 people feeling what I feel. It's a very kind of gloomy scenario. But you know, a couple of weeks ago, you shared with me, Alana, this great interview that you did with the gentleman farmer. And he said something that at the time struck me as like really kind of supremely stupid. He said, you know, sometimes I just sit in the meadow and watch the tree and I wonder what the tree feels. And I walked away being like, is this guy for real? Like, is he sitting there thinking about the emotional life of trees? The more I thought about it, the more it actually struck me as a deeply instructive kind of operating procedure. Because I think if you get into that mindset, you understand that one of the problems that we have right now is the problem of basically grasping things on a human scale. You know, most of us who grew up expect things to be more or less as we imagined them to be when we were coming up in the 90s or the 70s or even the 50s, meaning that the contours of reality as we've always known it would be more or less the same, that the institutions that shaped our lives would be more or less the same, that the political traditions that have stood kind of, you know, towering above us and guiding every element of our lives for 350 years would be more or less the same, that the religious, socioeconomic mores would be more or less the same. All of these are expectations that are so ingrained in us that we can't even see them as expectations. But if we make like trees and understand that humanity progresses on a totally different scale and a totally different kind of time code, I think we understand that part of the big conundrum and the reason this moment feels so ominous and so confusing and so heady to us is because we're experiencing not just a shift on this kind of like minute level, not just tiny tremors that make the cup on our desk quiver for a minute, like that water cup and when the dinosaur runs around in Jurassic Park, but really kind of a moment of epochal transformation, which if you read human history on a slightly larger canvas, makes perfect sense. So we could start and talk about the institutions and why they broke and how we got here. We could talk about the change in the information economy, which has always predicated big shifts in human political history. We could talk about the shift in ways of living. We could talk about 101 things, and they're all valid. The thing that I really think, and by the way, those would be questions that will concern historians, I think, for decades. The thing that I think is the most emotionally generative, and that I hope everyone takes away from as their point of departure. And I'm referring now again to another title of an amazing piece that you wrote that is in the reading list, is simply that everything is broken. That we are not looking at a situation in which, well, if we only had a good candidate that passed 3 or 4 nice policies and we figure out some way to start a much better university to compete with the university that isn't working and a slightly better newspaper that was a better version of this, then we would have something akin to the 90s again, and Kurt Cobain would come back to life, and we would all have a stable, beautiful, wonderful life of progress, prosperity, and happiness. That ain't happened. We're looking at a paradigm shift. We're looking at a time in which everything is destroyed, and that's really bad news, but also really good news, because everything now needs and must and can be rebuilt and rebuilt much better. To me, that's the emotional framing that we should take moving forward.
I'm really sad that Kurt Cobain's not coming back to life.
Oh, not yet. That happens in 2024. And then he runs for office.
I'm definitely not getting into Messiah politics with you tonight. We're going to keep that aside. Walter, to the extent that you come at this either from a different angle or using different language, can you tell us how you see this current moment? And before we're going to get into each of your own personal stories, but you can just articulate for us what you think we're all seeing now.
I think a lot of people have been separated from their principles by politics. I think a lot of people have been separated from their emotions by politics. That is, they started as empathetic viewers of life as a struggle between maybe the haves and have-nots, between authority and the working class, or the authoritarians and the populace. And they slowly found at first that this was a sort of left-wing position, that this was the classical description of a liberal, that you held out for the interests of the little person, as it were, or the discriminated against, or the victim of bigotry, and so on. And you also held out for some sort of economic justice between the largest institutions, our great corporations and so on, and the individual. If you held that position, if your makeup was such that the justice in those areas, or at least some sort of fairness, was essential to you, you saw more and more that the institutional left, the Democratic Party and its many subsidiary organizations, became almost breathtakingly impressed with authority, dismissive of the needs of the working class, culturally arrogant, such that they can't anymore even see the point of view of 3/4 of the country, whether that be the 3/4 that's below the waterline economically or between the great cosmopolitan coasts, doesn't matter. And as you watched your principles, one of them for me being free expression, slowly abandoned by the institutional left, and that's what I call it, you found yourself without shelter. As was described in the piece, The Turn, it was thought that you had a home in the Democratic Party, but the home moved. And that's been sort of my experience and that of others, that you were taking shelter under a sort of general sentimental ideological canopy that concerned itself with privacy and civil rights and economic fairness and so on. And you saw that thing become beholden to the greatest and most authoritarian powers in society. And so, to quote Norma Desmond of Sunset Boulevard, it wasn't that she started to fail, it was the pictures that got small. And it was the Democratic Party that got small-minded. And as you looked around for a place to go, the Republican Party, if you grew up having it sort of the anathema of selfishness and free market spirit crushing ruthlessness, was not at first your harbor in a storm. But increasingly, I think everybody who's faced this process has had to admit that they have to make alliances with those they formerly disdained or even dismissed or deplored. And so part of homelessness is that you get to meet the other homeless and you hang out on the street corner, drinking your Thunderbird wine and wondering. And so we've all found ourselves in mixed company suddenly. And I certainly have. Having to get along with people who I might have fought with in the old days, having to make a separate peace with conservatism, as it were, or libertarianism, or whatever the names are, because they shift. So that's, I think, the general picture. And when we get to the individual stories, I can be more vivid.
I want to get to it right now, because Walter, you are someone who had and has a legendary career in the blue chip real estate of what was literary journalism and book writing. And you could have and should be perfectly situated to benefit from a universe in which there's an ideology and you just go with it. And then you write into that space. And the question, I guess, for me is,
it gets hard to lie after a while, though.
But can you tell us a little bit about your background, why it is you think it's harder for you to lie than maybe other people? What is it about you that was allergic to what seemed to happen in the atmosphere?
To the bullshit, to quote the great title of Walter's piece about this.
I'll give you a fast motion biography. I grew up in rural Minnesota. My father, though he was a Princeton-educated patent attorney and a scientist, a chemical engineer, decided in the 70s that his family would live an authentic, almost Amish life of self-sacrifice out in the country. So I went to public school with farmers and rural people. And then because of my heat-seeking ambition as a young man, ended up at Princeton University, then Oxford University, then Vanity Fair magazine, then finally as a writer for the New Republic, Harper's, all the gold-plated Air Force One, Democratic presidential reading list magazines. And as I did that, and as time passed, especially in the last 10 years, I began to find myself obliged to object. I think the most strong signal came early when I wrote a piece for The Atlantic on surveillance under the Obama administration. And I saw that under an administration that allegedly cared about, the little guy and freedom and self actualization and all these other, sort of civil rights issues, a gross and systematic violation of everybody's civil rights had become absolute policy. As I started to see the dimensions of the corporate and government surveillance state, which isn't really a surveillance state, it's a manipulation state, as we've learned. They only surveil you the way that someone in a poker game looks at your cards, so they can beat you. And so they can move you into the category of non-threat. And as I wrote about that issue particularly, and then we moved into the Trump administration, and we had the Russiagate, quote unquote, scandal, the non-scandal, which asserted and caused every journalist to have to assert in choral fashion that our government was run by a Russian spy. Something I knew to be BS from the beginning, because I also knew some of the people who were propounding this thesis. And I thought, at some point, I'm going to have to get off of this ship of lies, because they're going to ask me to join in. And from the perspective of the little kid from Minnesota who, saluted the flag and joined the Cub Scouts, not that he made it very far, this is a abandonment of some sort of devotion to not just truth, but to the popular understanding of America as a place where free individuals actualize themselves in a somewhat free market and in a, undergirded by a welfare state. And I can't go any further. I have to stop. And when I had to stop, I found myself without friends. And, this is described in the piece in question, and without allies. And that drives you even further into your corner, because then you start to fight and you start to feel betrayed and you start to feel fooled. And I felt fooled. I went, this institutional left-wing media establishment that I joined because I wanted to battle dragons, the big guys. And it is the dragon. I'm like one of those cops in a film noir movie who finds out that he's really investigating the police department,
But wait, Walter, I think the thing that I think is useful for people the thing that I think has been striking for a lot of people that I've spoken to was their sense that actually a lot of the corporations and the monopolies that they had associated with doing bad things, but they had somehow divided them, that was different from the government. And obviously, like the clearest example of that right now is the sense that the government has to be different from pharmaceutical companies, and that our conversations around COVID and lockdowns and the way in which we've managed COVID, that we could separate out the government from pharmaceutical companies. And one of the things that I think has been useful for some people is realizing the extent to which, and the surveillance topic is a good example, the extent to which they're actually the same thing. And you're talking about one blob, not actually separate things. But the problem with that is that when you start to say this, even as I say this out loud, it's like you start to see your own tinfoil hat show. Like you're like, what do I look like or sound like? At which point, and this is actually a great segue into somebody who never cares whether he looks like he's wearing a tinfoil hat or anything else.
This is literally made of tinfoil.
So Liel, like, you've talked about this, and you talked about it a little bit in your piece. When you come to understand that what you know to be reality is not what you're looking at, it's not what's being described in front of you, it's not what everyone in your social sphere believes or says that they're looking at. And in order to describe what you know to be true, you are marginalizing yourself. Can you talk a little bit about
what happens then?
Right, and talk a little bit about how it feels, because that was one of the most moving parts, I think, of your piece, was the extent of isolation, which Walter referred to as well.
Right.
How does that dawn on you, and how do you absorb it?
See, so Walter, you had this throwaway line in your piece, which I found so amazing. You wrote something like, there were years in my life in which I didn't actually watch TV or read a newspaper. Like the information I got about the world came from having conversations with humans and looking at art and just like living and absorbing, the emotional thing. And to me, that has always been a kind of very wise, profound way of sort of like going about in the world. I don't want to rehash what I already wrote in the piece. I just want to kind of briefly expand on one instance that I mentioned, but that was actually way more painful and traumatic than anything I led on. So I had while in my misspent youth in graduate school, a good friend, a colleague, a mentor, an older gentleman who really sort of connected with me on a level that I believed was far more than the sort of collegiate professorial student relationship, a much more kind of deep, profound love, if I may. And one day I got an email from him summoning me to lunch. Now, you can go back and read part of the tragedy of having made the poor life choices that Walter and I made, is that our entire lives are in the public domain. You could go back and check all these things. I used to be, I think, definitely in the context of tablets universe, but also probably objectively very much a creature of the left. And when I wrote about Israel Palestine, I'm originally from Tel Aviv. I wrote sort of like adamantly from the perspective of what had always been my political home, which was the Israeli left, or some would even say, far left. And yet I started kind of looking at reality around me and having a bunch of questions. This is not the topic, so I won't expand on this, but basically feeling as if the ideas and people who I had supported were way more committed to sort of extolling my demise than investing in any sort of peaceful coexistence. And I started asking these questions out loud, which is when my mentor summoned me to a lunch in which he said, I really think you should watch out. You're starting to sound a little bit weird when you talk about Israel and Palestine. You're starting to speak in ways that aren't, comfortable for people around here. And I said, oh, wow, what a great conversation to have. I mean, Jews arguing, this is what we do. Like, oh, let's open it up. And I try to kind of like get at it from different directions. Oh, do you mean because I believe in this? Is this a policy problem? Is this the politician that I criticize? What is going on here? And at some point he just cut me off and said, no, you don't understand. You sound too tribal. And it wasn't so much what he said, although there was definitely a touch of Soviet style to it, being like, you don't understand, comrade, the party is watching you a little bit. But it was the tone in which it was delivered that struck me as so devoid of empathy, so devoid of love, so devoid of care. Because if this was someone I truly cared about and loved and wanted to save, I would never have spoken in these metallic, tones. And so I sort of sprung into full, defense mode and said, okay, well, let me ask you a hypothetical question. Let's assume I'm an alien coming from Earth. I clearly don't understand politics because what you're saying sounds insane to me. I thought we were here in college, right, in a university environment, to debate all the observable realities and form our ideas based on what we could see and what we know and what we understand. But let's assume I was an alien coming from a different planet and I wanted to understand the world. And he talked to me about politics. And the gentleman says, well, it's very easy. There are two parties. One of them is sort of sometimes weak-willed and sometimes disorganized, and there's some bad players. But overall, it's a great party. It's committed to helping women and people of color and minorities and poor people, and it's really good. And I was like, oh, that sounds like an amazing party. I'll definitely support it. Just out of curiosity, what's the other party? And then he looks at me like I asked, where do babies come from? I'm like, this is sort of like super obvious question.
I need another part.
And he says, oh, they're fucking Nazis. Like, do you even have to ask? And so, I pay the bill. I say, thank you so much for this. And I walk home with two insights. The first is, right, I'm the tribal one. But the second one, which was way more profound, was exactly about this thing, Walter, that you speak of in the piece. And this is when the shift becomes really personal. We could all come to terms, or perhaps some of us could come to terms more easily than others with turning blind eyes, shall we say, to the follies of our own camp. We could all kind of fudge the truth just so much. We've all lived through moments in which we look at highly imperfect candidates, things, phenomenon on our side, and say to ourselves, if this was my mortal enemy, I would be way more shrill. I'm willing to kind of, because we're not perfect. I understand that. I'm not going to be this kind of like pure moralist as well. You should judge impartially. Fuck impartiality. We're human beings. We belong to tribes. We belong to families. That's what I love about us. But here's what I will not stand for and won't tolerate. It's that cruelty. It's that coldness. It's that notion that as soon as the political dime turns, you can no longer love that person. You can no longer be their friend. You need to demand their excommunication, their exile into some different land. That struck me as honestly just post-human. And as soon as I saw this being the kind of beating heart of this terrible dark moment, I said, I don't even care what you believe. I just want out.
You know, when I was a kid, I grew up, as I say, in Minnesota, and I went to a public school. In about 7th or 8th grade, you have these dawn of consciousness books that are assigned, like 1984 and Brave New World and Fahrenheit 451. And it struck me as I read them that I didn't want to be the bad guy in those books. That it was a pre-political intuition that the heroes of those books, who were being chased, watched, subjugated, interrogated, and so on, were actually the heroes, and the dark and sort of undifferentiated forces of power that were arrayed against them were people you didn't want to be. And to put it very simply, the way a child could understand, I saw American institutional left-wing politics morphing into the bad guy in those books. There didn't seem to be a Defense Department official, a intelligence operation, a big war, a surveillance technology, a corporate behemoth that they didn't find a way to love.
But guys, but hold on a minute. This is where I think a lot of people, certainly people who are not, who unfortunately for them don't have to spend their lives following this every day, but who at least many people who are coming to this right now are so struck by the difference between what they believe liberalism and the left says it stands for, and what you are saying is behind the curtain. And
it's not very behind the curtain anymore. I mean, CNN has ex-CIA directors as analysts, ex-NSA directors. We have got a state now. I could have told you how this COVID thing would run on March of over a year ago. I mean, the fact is, to give the right some credit, they have been correct in their most paranoid precincts about the drift toward sort of authoritarian regime, using people's private information, using techniques of disinformation and psyops developed during our last 30 years of war, which have come home to America. And I mean, I'll wear the damn tinfoil hat, because if it fits, wear it. Anyone who has taken the more paranoid and less reasonable attitude toward these forces has been proved correct on a weekly, monthly, and annual basis. And after a while, you have to look at the track record and not the ideology. And the truth is that people who have warned of more intrusive, more divisive, and more sort of corporate interventions in our private lives, and as well as the suppression of free expression, which for me is the Maginot line. You know, that's the line you don't cross. And when I saw the left starting to cross into this obsession with misinformation, which was really just a relabeled word for censorship, I went, no, they're the enemy. Because I'm a novelist. I'm not just a thinker about everyday political issues. I'm somebody who characterizes the deep experience of being human. And these people were stepping on it, and they were constricting it, and they were systematically advocating for a system which takes right thinking and exalts it institutionally, and takes wrong think and cuts it off at the source, maybe even turns it into a real crime. And I went, no.
I want to ask you guys something. When I published my own piece almost a year ago, there was one response that I received from dozens of people. And you could feel the anxiety through the screen. And their response was, everything is broken? Really? Really? I just took a great plane ride. I just actually, America, our food supply is fabulous. Like there was just this sense of,
Right.
Of deep anxiety about the notion that, first of all, the idea that things could be much more decayed than people realized. And also, and this is what I'd like to get into, an anxiety about what to do about it. But my question for you is, both of you are quite clear about your sense of the problem, and the clarity is useful to you individually. But can you imagine yourself sitting in a bar with somebody who is just coming, like the light is just starting to peek in? How would you engage that person? How would you explain to that person why what they're seeing is what you're seeing?
So we've reached the solutions part of the evening, in other words, which is great.
Well, before we get there, I want to talk about the very real emotional reorientation that I think is the middle step between understanding that the world that you're looking at is not what you thought and moving forward. There's this bridge moment. So can you first talk about the bridge, and then we'll get into sort of what you think people should, how you think people should address things moving forward.
Go ahead, Walter.
Well, I was just saying, I want to hear you first. It's just the alienation phase. It's the point at which you realize that your former friends, your former sources, your former trusted authorities may be a bit dubious, and you know, and it does have an emotional component. And I want to hear more about it because you addressed that more.
Yeah, I mean, to me that this is a supremely difficult question, because Alana, this is exactly the sort of conversation that you know, and I think a lot of us still have, even among ourselves. And I don't want for one second to dismiss, you know, the sort of ominous nature and enormity of this moment. I mean, how to watch the world burn and say, it ain't coming back, man. Rome, we're not going to build a better Rome, build back better Rome, right? We're just not going to do it. It's going to be something completely different. How do we get there? How do we cross this bridge? Look, I could give 101 kind of different solutions and answers. They're all parlor tricks, right? I could say, okay, well, you know, check the boundaries of what you can't say. And in the piece, I refer to all sorts of statements. Good luck coming and saying, hey, you know what? I don't think that rioting and looting and beating up police is the greatest way to express your commitment to social justice. Try saying that in polite company. Try saying that you believe that there are only two genders. You know, those are things that are no longer permissible in many circles. And it boggles the mind because they were so incredibly banal and obvious as to not even require stating. So I could say go that route. I could say go, you know, a kind of an emotional route of almost like a 10-step, like an AA program, right? Go through denial, go through anger, go through. I think that's probably the best solution. Go through rage, feel the sadness. This is not a moment of giddiness. It's not a moment of triumph. It's not a moment of elation. Look, personally, I came to this country. This is like the most cliched immigrant story. I had $2,000 in my pocket the day I arrived 250 of which were taken almost immediately because I stupidly took a cab that took me from JFK to Westchester via like Boston, because I was literally the guy like, oh, wow, this guy's holding a sign at the airport. He seems real nice. And literally the day after my arrival, I took the train this time. Thankfully, I learned my lesson, took the train to Columbia University and stood there and like gawked at it, gazed at it for a good like hour and a half. Because in my mind, here's the story. I'm going to get in here. I'm going to get a really great education. I'm going to be a professor. I'm going to write for all the publications I always dreamed of writing about. And my American dream will come true. And then a terrible thing had happened. It did come true at exactly the right moment in which all these institutions collapse. So I feel the pain acutely, and I think everyone should take a moment and feel the pain. But then, and that's maybe the transition to what we could actually do, understand that a moment of brokenness is a moment of tremendous opportunity. I don't want to sound too religious here, although this is profoundly the way I approach the world, but I deeply believe that we were placed here. That's a great privilege to have been placed here at this particular moment, because the rebuilding that we are going to do is going to be glorious in the future of this country. While I'm so dark about the next, say, 3 to 5 years, I couldn't be more cheerful and more optimistic about the next 10 or 15.
You know, we're going to have a little bit of a dedicated Q&A at the end, where I'm going to try to get to as many questions as possible. I'm also going to try to weave relevant questions in. And I think there's one that fits what you just talked about, Liel. Somebody just wrote and said, how might artists who've experienced the turn engage to create meaningful work now that they don't fit into the mold of the left?
All right.
Walter, can you start?
Well, some viewers may know that I'm probably chiefly a novelist and a short story writer and a writer of literary memoirs. And so I think of that as my sort of first identity. And this is a good question, because the arts community and the publishing establishment and so on are grounded in a kind of institutional liberal reality. And as you move from it, you start to face things like job loss, which I've faced, refusal to publish something you've written, which I've faced, abandonment by your friends, fear. You find yourself on committees in which you're alone in championing a certain work of art against 4 other people who, you know, are taking a more woke approach. And you start to go, wow, I'm going to end up alone, silent, and obscure here. But this is all happening, this turn, accompanied by a technological change, which should not be underestimated as both a propeller of the turn and as a instrument of furthering it. In other words, I now publish on Substack.com. You know what Substack.com is? It's simply a website that allows me to say what I feel, publicize it in a fairly, successful fashion, and be paid to a degree. And the ability to do that and to detach myself from the mastheads of the big magazines and the credentialing of the authoritative arts and culture establishment is something that I cling to now. And so many of us do. And the fact is that from Tablet Magazine to the various Substacks available to the various mediums that allow us to publish and to promote art that aren't part of the Borg, though they may start with smaller audiences, and though we may not win prizes for using them, we are going to build a great cathedral, a new cathedral, not the old one, using them. And we've already started. And so there's hope, but you're going to have to pass through the underworld.
Hold on one second. Night. So now, and while you're passing through the underworld, you are going to be seen. And this is a question that comes from our audience that I think is a good one. How do you get over the insecurity of feeling like you're being seen as wearing a tinfoil hat.
So let me connect to this because Walter so graciously played the part of the inspiring statesman here. Let me play the role of the bastard and say that there is not an insignificant part of me that kind of, with all the empathy and with all the kind of emotional understanding, kind of rails at that question. Here's the thing, guys. This is America. This is not a nation that was ever built by people who sat aside and asked, like, well, but who's going to do this? Who's going to give me this degree? Who's going to champion me? Who's going to give me this prize? The answer to all these questions is fuck it. The person who is looking at you like you have the tin hat, the thing to say to this person is fuck you, which is throughout history. And you need to have read precisely 4 books before you come for any 4 great novels before you come across this idea that this is what artists have always done. We have always been the unwashed, slightly odorous weirdos on the sidelines being like, nah, man, that's not true. Like, here is how I see the world, and suffer for it greatly. And be ostracized for it frequently, and starve because of it, and all the sorrow that is connected with it. But at some point, we have made this kind of cult of professionalization that, according to which, if you didn't attend Columbia and or Princeton and or NYU and or Oxford, if you don't get those grants, if you don't have that paycheck from that magazine, all the source of accreditation now lies with these institutions. If you need New York University to tell you you're a writer, you are not a writer.
So
okay, on that very sensitive and warm note, I do.
My mug says heart, by the way.
Okay, guys, we have all been at in conversations like this one, and at some point, someone looks at us and says, "Oh, okay, what now? What am I supposed to do? What do I do?" In the remaining time, I want us to go from the broad end of the funnel to the narrow one.
So let me start.
What do you
be
do?
Very kind of, be very brief about it. We were joking before the conversation went public, and I said that if you're asking what the answer is always is alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. I'm only a quarter joking here, but I will say this, and I'll try to be as prescriptive as I can. The first thing that you do is you realize the magnum nature of the moment that is upon us, and you realize that these kind of band-aidy solutions of like, well, we could kind of build the 1990s, but build them slightly better. That ain't gonna work. You have to realize that this is Dresden and the year is 1945, and everything has been firebombed. There's literally not 2 stones standing on top of one another. Everything needs to be rebuilt. This brings me to the exciting, generative, wonderful, optimistic moment. Number 1, do not wait for anyone to come and build the thing for you. Number 2, realize that the building needn't to begin with like, oh, so do we need like a third party? Whatever, man. We need a school for your kids first. We need agriculture that doesn't poison you with industrial farming. We need like so many things that are way more desperately, needed than politics. And here's the last thing that I would say, and I think that's the point that gives me the most hope and the most excitement. Whatever it is that speaks to your soul, to your heart, whatever it is that strikes you as closest to your emotional valence and to your set of skills, that is exactly your mission. That is what you have to do. If you're a great educator and you want to come up with a set of curricula for the growing throngs of people who every day tune out of the official educational system and homeschool their kids, people who are still now being called weirdos, but trust me, 5 years from now, if not the majority, there will be a very substantial portion. If you want to go into that, and by the way, this is not just like, oh, I'll do this and it's a little cottage industry. Every single one of these ideas I'm going to throw around has potential for being super freaking big business, right? If you want to go in and you feel the calling in a spiritual sense, right? And you want to go in and come up with some kind of solution that disrupts the inherently politicized, sclerotic, and less popular way of conducting religion, that's great. If you are unlucky enough to be a writer or an artist, Walter, I think very beautifully detailed what life looks like when you stop worrying about acceptance and start actually doing the work that you want to do, and finding out these new ways of connecting with audiences, whatever it is that you want, from farming to writing to politics. It doesn't happen on the scale it used to happen. It doesn't happen with the same kind of, thumbs up from the man that it used to that you used to get. But that is incredibly exciting. What to do? The answer is everything and whatever you want.
So I'm going to reduce my answer to a series of self-help style bullet points.
Excellent.
Number one, get over your prestige addiction. Wherever you think you have needed the certification of prestigious institutions, you've probably compromised yourself, and you've probably intoxicated yourself with bad chemicals. Get over your prestige addiction. Number two, make new friends. No matter how old you are, make new friends. The fact is that really the biggest problem about making the turn is social. It has to do with friends and family. You can't make a new family. Well, you can, especially if you're young and fertile. But if you're a little bit older like me, you have to develop a new social life. And I largely have. I mean, every step of the turn for me has been accompanied, I'm afraid, by the falling away of old relationships and the substitution of new ones. And the great thing about the new ones is that they weren't formed by mere propinquity. Oh, we all went to college together, or, we are all ended up in the same, office. But now I'm choosing with agency, to use a kind of left-wing word, my friends and associates. So get over your prestige addiction, make new friends. And number three, realize everything great starts small. I'm a student of American cultural and literary movements. I'm especially infatuated with the beat literary movement of the 1950s and early 60s. You know what the beat movement really started as? Allen Ginsberg and his drunk friends. I mean, they were a bunch of guys who were hanging out in New York, and they went around to San Francisco and a couple other places. And they published books using a bookstore in San Francisco in the cheapest editions, the City Lights bookstore, which you can still visit, a monument to the old left. And they created a sweeping cultural movement that by the end of the 1960s dominated music, dominated independent film, and certainly poetry and literature in some ways. So don't you want to start with a small group and branch out rather than start on a giant iceberg as it breaks up, melts, and returns to the ocean? That's your choice. I say option one is exciting, and option two is kind of tragic.
As a litmus test, one of our questions just came in, and I think I'm going to ask it out loud to see both of your reactions. So, who will you vote for?
I vote for Alana Newhouse.
No, seriously.
What do you mean?
Okay, Walter Kirn.
Who will I vote for? Presidential election 2024, you mean?
I mean, I think that
just in general.
The question is generally, who will you vote for? And I think that the focus on and the obsession with politics, while well-meaning, is actually stopping us from being able to build new things.
That's exactly how I feel. Who cares? Honestly, who the fuck cares? Who would I vote for? Whoever. Yes, I understand. My dog is so upset by this question that she's, letting us know. I understand that this is a two-party system. I understand that we have to vote for side A or side B. I understand that in every election cycle, there would be one side that is slightly better. I don't particularly care for or like either one of these parties, although right now, if I'm being completely honest, I see much more I dislike emotionally and fundamentally about the Democratic Party than about the Republican Party. But even the asking of this question indicates to me that a lot of emotional work needs to be done, because the building that I truly care about, the kind that propels humanity forward, doesn't come by asking, okay, so which kind of oligarch,
Wait,
which
but I think it's
78-year-old
actually, I think
billionaire
there's
will
something
I
else.
entrust my future to?
I think it's actually something else, which is, and I understand the anxiety, but it's basically, who can I offload the responsibility for rebuilding to?
Right, no one.
And
It's you. It's your
I
job.
think that unfortunately the answer is it does. If you're, once you're offloading, if you're still in the offloading phase,
Right.
this society that you want to exist in 10 years is not going to. We're going to have to do it ourselves. Final thing for you guys before I actually go into some reader questions. What do you feel what do you want to see in the next year?
I want to see the total dismantling of the engineered, fabricated, divisive war of all on all and each on each that our politics has subjected us to in this country. I want to see the hippies and the rednecks come together. I want to see the vaccinated and embrace the unvaccinated. It's not that I want to see, I don't want to give the world a Coke and have us all hug each other, but I want the people to look at one another and say, have we been well served by the cleavages that have been visited on us from the top? I would like to see, and I'll use the word populist because I'm not going to mince words here. I would like to see a populist revival of self-confidence and self-esteem on the part of the American electorate, such that they turn together to look with a very, very critical and severely, maybe even punitive eye at the people who have dragged them through hell, ruined their children's educations, destroyed the small business that next door, and created rifts in their own families over the last couple of years, all over a medical crisis that, not to speak to its severity or its reality, was a manageable one and need not have become a kind of five-dimensional civil war.
I see your comment, and I'm gonna raise you. I'm gonna raise you one. I'm gonna say it's not just the cleaving of society to two camps. What I'd like to see, and they're very closely related, I'd like to see a return to humanity. I would like to see an abandonment of all these practices, the extreme, severe avoidance of any risk at all cost, the tendency to look at human life through metrics that are only tangentially relevant to what we are. A tendency to ignore the things that every faith system teaches us are the most profound, like the well-being of children, like love between people, like respect, like the questions of pondering, what we're doing here on this planet and what our goals are. These are all things that have been taken away from us. The taking away started before COVID. It has been facilitated greatly by the ascent of this noxious, nauseating technology that has now permeated every corner of our lives, due to which so many people spend their times binging on Netflix and shopping on Zappos or Amazon or what have you, and engaging less and less and less in actual humanly recognized activities. And COVID sort of sealed this fate of subservience. I would like to see all that broken off. I suspect that the breaking off will be figuratively or literally violent. And I trust that at the end of this would be something better. Because Walter, I love the way you said it before, and what you said about the beats. The thing that I really feel, it's 1964, man, right? And we're the weird kids in the garages with the guitars coming up with this new sound that is like totally inspired by what we kind of get in the atmosphere. And the nerds in the squares are the ones out there, watching CNN and repeating the talking point. Guess who wins at the end?
Actually, I want to, there's a couple of questions from the crowd, all getting at one thing, which relates to that, which is that a lot of this conversation, which is true, this conversation is oriented toward people who traditionally found themselves on the left who are disillusioned or feel betrayed or abandoned. But there's a question wanting to know your thoughts about the right, and from two different directions. Both, do you feel the right has had its reckoning with the problems or the hypocrisies of conservatism? And actually, I think more deeply, what about all the people on the right who had this correct all along? So Liel, while you were out hobnobbing on the Upper West Side with your fancy parties, and there were people who actually were standing up for this, who you were demonizing.
Mhm.
The question is how do you approach them, your own reckoning? Walter, how do you feel about the conversations that you would want? Because you're both talking about wanting coming together of people, but what's your responsibility inside of those conversations?
So I know time is running out. I'll keep my answers brief because I'm also deeply curious to hear what Walter has to say. There's a person who I hope is watching us now, who went to school with me and stood very differently on the issues than I did, and I did my best to demonize her in person, in print, in any form, way, shape possible.
Say who it was.
Her name is Barry Weiss, who some of you may know and some of you may love almost as much as we do. And as fate would have it, we ended up not only working at the same place but being dear friends. And it gives me the greatest pleasure, and I could never do it enough, to apologize giddily, joyfully to Barry and say that she was 100% right and I was 100% wrong. And nothing about this apology is anything short than and joyous to me. Because what could be better than not only being guided to something that is true, but also being guided by wonderful people who then become your dear, dear, dear beloved friend, which is the second point that I want to make. The point that Walter also referred to before, the thing that makes this homelessness so wonderful to me is knowing all the possibilities that are suddenly opening up when you stop looking at the world through these dogmatic lenses. It's not that I expect the right to be perfect any more than I expect the left to be perfect. The notion that any one camp would be perfect is ridiculous to me. And for that matter, if I wanted to be difficult, I could say that even these categories, left and right, I mean, really the left is the left, the champions of big surveillance, big business, no freedom, that's the left. No, I don't accept any of this. But I will say that the thing that gives me the greatest pleasure is the knowledge that you can change, because that's the essence of human life. It's the essence of thought. It's the essence of art. And that as you change, you're going to meet the Barry Weisses of this world. You're going to meet amazing people who then become your family.
As far as the right goes, show some humility. A lot of them had the right idea. A lot of the traditionalists on the right, the people who exalt spirituality, religion, classical learning, those sorts of things, and who are not these year zero, let's wipe it all out and have a revolution people. A lot of those people need to be apologized to, because they were admiring and attempting to protect structures without which we're seeing a lot of chaos. And so my simple answer, as much as I want to get into all the niceties of why left and right aren't the greatest way to classify ourselves in the first place, I'll be plain spoken and simply say, you who didn't consider yourself to be on the right, who might have thought they were the enemy, maybe want to show a little humility, given their track record on predicting and protecting and sort of warning about things that have come to pass.
Okay. I hear all of you guys. I see you guys saying that you want us to go on. Unfortunately, we can't tonight, but if you send me an email and you beg, we can do this again. We'll definitely, we can try to have this conversation and expand on it, and maybe keep talking, maybe bring in some other people. Couple of last things before we say goodbye to everyone. One, I want to remind everyone that the email address to write to any of us is newlifeworld@protonmail.com. I put it in, we're going to put it in the chat. If you have a specific question for Walter or Liel or me, I promise it'll get to one of us.
And we actually respond.
And we'll
for real.
respond. And you can also give us suggestions if you want us to create a Zoom about a specific topic or something you feel like some rabbit hole you want us to go down. Definitely tell us by email. Also, don't forget to sign up for Walter's Substack, for Tablet's newsletter. Tonight only, anyone who signs up, you are entered to win a raffle. Let's see if actually God smiles down on you and delivers locks to your door. And third thing and final is we are going to once again drop in the chat our reading list. There are 10 great articles, all of which can start you off. To those of you who haven't read any of them, they're very, very good. And they go back to at least to 2015, at least the tablet pieces do. So with that, I want to thank Liel, obviously, for writing this piece and starting us off on this conversation. And also a huge thank you to Walter for coming in and elevating us and our conversation and for giving us your perspective. I'm so grateful to both of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks.
Have a good night, everyone.
Yep.